Imagine being thrown into a pit, your limbs bound and helpless, as a pack of ravenous dogs rips into your body. Their teeth tear through your flesh, blood spilling onto the cold ground as you scream in agony, each bite ripping deeper. You try to move, but it's too late. The dogs tear you apart, piece by piece, until you are nothing but a broken, mangled corpse. This wasn't a nightmare. This was real. Eaten alive by dogs was an execution so brutal, so horrific, that it's been buried by time. But the terror of it remains. In ancient times, dogs, symbols of loyalty, were turned into instruments of unimaginable terror. Rebels, traitors, and criminals were thrown to the dogs. Their final moments spent in a pit of agony, devoured alive. The brutality wasn't just physical. It was designed to break the spirit and leave a lasting horror, witnessed by all. The condemned were bound or left completely helpless in an open area, often tossed into a pit or cage, their bodies exposed and vulnerable. There was no escape, no mercy. The dogs, either trained hounds or wild, hungry beasts, were released into the pit, their eyes filled with a feral hunger as they descended upon their prey. The cruelty of the moment was staggering. The hounds didn't rush in to end the victim's life quickly. No, the agony was prolonged, each bite a new wave of pain. The dogs would tear into the victim's limbs first, gnawing at the arms and legs, ripping away pieces of flesh. The screams of the victim were met with the sound of snapping jaws and the sickening sound of flesh being shredded. With every agonizing second, the victim was alive, fully conscious, as the dogs slowly devoured them piece by piece. Pain raked through their body as the dogs moved from the limbs to the torso, leaving the victim alive for hours, their skin being torn away, their blood pooling on the ground. It wasn't just the physical pain that made this execution method so horrific. It was the mental torment, knowing that you had no chance of survival, that you would die at the jaws of animals, slowly, painfully, in front of an audience. The fear of being consumed alive by dogs was unlike any other execution method. No dignity, no mercy. Just the certainty that you would be reduced to nothing more than prey for animals, your body being torn apart for the world to see. The public spectacle made it all the more grotesque. Crowds would gather around the execution site, drawn by the horror of it. The victim's death wasn't just an execution. It was a show, a reminder of the power the rulers held, and the terrifying consequences of defying them. For the onlookers, it wasn't enough to just hear the victim's screams. They had to see the torment, witness the savagery as the dogs ripped apart the condemned, each bite a visible demonstration of what happened to those who crossed the state. You thought your worst nightmare was running from an angry dog. Imagine being caught and eaten alive, piece by piece, while the world watches, powerless to stop it. This wasn't just an execution. It was death by humiliation, designed to not only kill the body, but to strip away any humanity the victim had left, turning them into nothing but a carcass for the dogs. The brutality was never quick, never clean. The agony was slow, lingering, and every moment spent in that pit was another moment of terror, suffering, and ultimate destruction. The horrifying use of dogs in execution can be traced back to ancient Rome, where the ruling powers saw them as not only loyal companions, but as instruments of terror. Dogs were often used to track down enemies and to enforce the law, but in the most brutal corners of the empire, they were also unleashed to carry out the most savage executions. They weren't used merely for hunting or protection. They were turned into beasts of punishment, forced to kill in front of crowds, a chilling reminder of the power held by those in control. In the Middle Ages, this method of execution found its place in the arsenal of punishment. The dog's role was not just to kill, but to terrorize. Their wild instincts made them perfect for this brutal task. Unlike the domesticated dogs of today, the hounds used for execution were trained to tear into their victims without hesitation. These dogs were wild, not pets, but savage creatures, chosen specifically for their aggressive nature. They were let loose on the condemned, and the process was long, drawn out, and incredibly painful. The dogs were often kept hungry to increase their ferocity, which made the victims' suffering all the more horrific. The social context surrounding these executions made them even more terrifying. Dogs, in ancient and medieval times, were seen as loyal but also savage animals, perfectly suited for such cruel tasks. They were revered for their loyalty, but also feared for their unpredictable violence. To turn these animals into executioners was to use the symbol of loyalty against those who were seen as threats to the power structure. The use of dogs was meant to remind the populace that loyalty to the state and its rulers was not optional. Those who violated this order were often dehumanized, reduced to little more than prey for animals. The method was about public humiliation as much as it was about execution. The condemned would be thrown into a pit or an open area where the dogs were released upon them. It wasn't just about death. It was about the power of the state being shown in the most violent way possible. It wasn't enough to simply execute someone in a clean, efficient manner. The public spectacle of someone being eaten alive by dogs was meant to instill fear in the hearts of the population. It was a brutal, visible reminder that no one was safe if they crossed the rulers or the laws of the land. The legal and cultural roots of this method tied into the most serious crimes of the time: treason, sacrilege, and rebellion. These were crimes that were considered too severe for more conventional methods of execution, like beheading or hanging. For such grave offenses, the punishment had to match the severity, and eaten alive by dogs became the ultimate form of retribution. It was reserved for those who threatened the very foundation of society, those who dared to defy the power of the ruling authorities. In many ways, the use of dogs was a reflection of the brutality that was embedded in these cultures. The method wasn't just about removing the criminal. It was about sending a message that disobedience would be met with terror, humiliation, and a fate that no one could survive. The victims of being eaten alive by dogs were often those who posed the greatest threat to the established order: rebels, traitors, heretics, and anyone who dared to disrupt the authority of the rulers. This method of execution was reserved for those whose crimes were deemed unforgivable, and the punishment served as a public reminder of the price one paid for defying the law. One of the most chilling aspects of this brutal fate was the execution of high-ranking individuals or enemies of the state. Political figures, military leaders, or even wealthy individuals who had fallen out of favor with the ruling class were often sentenced to be torn apart by dogs. Their fate wasn't just about death. It was about sending a message to anyone who might challenge the power structure. The idea was that no one, no matter how powerful or respected, was immune to the wrath of the state. Those who once held power were reduced to prey, a symbol of the ruler's dominance. In the case of rebels, those who fought against the empire or monarchy, the dogs were a tool of terror, used to break the will of anyone considering resistance. These were not quick executions. Rebels were often thrown into pits, bound and helpless, watching as the dogs circled them, waiting for the signal to attack. The process was slow and painful, making sure the victims' fear and suffering lasted long enough to leave an unforgettable mark on the crowd watching. However, it wasn't just powerful men who faced such an agonizing fate. Women, slaves, and peasants were often sentenced to this brutal end, sacrificed to the dogs, simply because they were seen as expendable. Women, particularly those accused of witchcraft or disobedience, were sometimes condemned to this horrific fate, seen as lesser and therefore worthy of such a cruel death. Slaves, who were considered property, had little protection from such a brutal punishment. And peasants, those who were too poor or powerless to challenge their rulers, could find themselves torn apart by dogs simply for the crime of resisting authority or daring to rise up against their oppressors. Throughout history, racial or political targets were also frequently sent to the dogs. This punishment was often used on those who were seen as threats to the ruling class, whether they were ethnic minorities, religious dissenters, or those who opposed the monarchy or empire. It didn't matter if you were a man or woman, a noble or a peasant. If you threatened the power of the ruling authority, you could find yourself reduced to nothing more than food for the dogs. These executions were meant to serve as brutal, visible warnings to anyone who might think about rebelling, resisting, or challenging the status quo. In these societies, the value of human life was often determined by class, race, and political loyalty. Those deemed expendable were sacrificed to the dogs, forced to suffer an agonizing, humiliating death. The execution was not just a form of punishment, it was a statement of power, a demonstration that the rulers could erase anyone, regardless of their status, if they dared to defy the system. The victims of this fate were not just punished for their crimes. They were made examples of, their deaths a message to the rest of society. Challenge the state, and you too could be reduced to prey for hungry dogs. The psychological horror of this execution method was as cruel as the physical suffering it caused. Imagine knowing, with absolute certainty, that your death would come slowly and painfully, and that it would be publicly witnessed. There was no hope for escape, no quick release from the torment. Every moment spent in that pit or cage, bound and helpless, was a moment spent in the crushing knowledge that you would be torn apart, piece by piece, by the dogs. The slow, inevitable descent into agony was enough to break anyone before the dogs even touched them. The fear of dogs was deeply ingrained in the human psyche. For many, dogs represented untamable aggression, wild beasts capable of ripping apart anything in their path. The slow tearing of flesh by these animals would not only leave the body bruised and bleeding, but would psychologically shatter the victim long before their death. The snarls, the growls, and the sounds of sharp teeth sinking into skin. These sounds would be heard long before the first bite, amplifying the fear and anxiety that began to overtake the victim. There was no way to prepare for the horror that was about to unfold. The victim's screams and pleas for mercy would mix with the sounds of the dogs tearing into their flesh, but these cries were often ignored. In most cases, the victim would be left to die for hours, sometimes even days, as the dogs continue their relentless assault. The suffering was not just physical, it was emotional, a constant reminder that death was not swift, it was not merciful. It was a slow and lingering process, the body slowly consumed by the dogs, as the victim's strength and spirit slowly faded away. As each piece of flesh was torn away, the victim's mind would fray, struggling to hold on to whatever shred of hope remained, even as their body was being devoured by the hungry animals. It's one thing to run from dogs. It's another to have them slowly eat you alive as the world watches. The victory was not just the pain of being consumed alive. It was the humiliation, the terror, the complete loss of agency, and the final realization that no one was coming to save them. This punishment wasn't just about ending a life. It was about destroying the soul, forcing the condemned to experience the most horrifying mental and emotional collapse possible before their body finally succumbed. The terror of being eaten alive, fully aware of your fate, made this method of execution not just physically torturous, but a psychological torment that could break even the strongest person long before their body was consumed by the dogs. In ancient Rome, the use of dogs for execution was not just a method, but a statement of power. Emperors like Caligula and Nero were notorious for their cruelty, and it is believed that they used dogs to dispose of enemies, traitors, and those who dared to oppose them. Caligula, in particular, known for his sadistic cruelty, often used wild animals to execute those who defied his reign, with dogs often among the instruments of death. His enemies, political rivals, and even members of his own court were subjected to these horrific deaths, torn apart by dogs as a display of the emperor's unchecked authority. The public spectacle served not only as a method of execution, but as a reminder of the emperor's absolute control. No one was safe from his wrath. During the Middle Ages, this brutal practice became a tool for political control and public humiliation. Traitors to the crown, heretics, and even thieves were often condemned to a gruesome fate, thrown into pits filled with hungry dogs, left to be devoured alive as the onlookers gathered around. These executions were designed to send a chilling message to anyone who would dare oppose the monarchy or the church. One infamous example is the case of a medieval nobleman accused of plotting against the crown. After a public trial, he was dragged to a pit, bound, and left to be torn apart by dogs as the crowd looked on, too terrified or mesmerized to intervene. His agonizing screams echoed throughout the square, mixing with the sounds of tearing flesh as the dogs ripped into his body. The early modern period saw a continuation of this horrifying method of execution, albeit less frequently. In 16th century Europe, high-profile criminals, especially those accused of treason, were executed this way in front of crowds, often as a spectacle of power. These executions became less about swift justice and more about humiliation and terror. One particularly chilling case took place in England, where a man accused of plotting to assassinate a noble was sentenced to be thrown into a pit of hounds. His death was slow, agonizing, and witnessed by hundreds of spectators. The victim's cries were drowned out by the sounds of gnashing teeth and tearing flesh, and by the time the dogs had finished, there was little left of him but a bloodied, mangled corpse. These personal stories from history serve as grim reminders of the darkness that permeated the law and justice systems of the past. It wasn't just criminals and enemies of the state who faced this horrific end. Anyone who had angered a powerful figure could be condemned to such a fate. Victims of political intrigue, thieves, or even those who were simply in the wrong place at the wrong time, were thrown to the dogs, their agonizing deaths becoming a macabre form of entertainment for the public. In some rare cases, survivors or witnesses of these executions described the sheer terror and helplessness of watching a loved one or friend meet such a brutal end. One account describes a man whose brother was thrown into a pit and devoured by dogs. The witness recounted how the victim was still alive for long enough to scream, the crowd silently watching as the dogs attacked. The witness himself was so traumatized by the scene that he was never able to forget the horror of watching his brother being torn apart in front of him, unable to do anything but watch in helplessness and fear. This brutal, public spectacle of execution sent a clear message: defy authority, and you would meet a fate worse than death, a slow, agonizing end, torn apart by animals. The psychological impact was just as profound as the physical pain, forever altering those who witnessed it, or were forced to endure the torment. The crowd's role in these executions was not born out of necessity, but out of a morbid fascination with the brutality of the act. People gathered not just to witness a punishment, but to be entertained by the savagery that unfolded before their eyes. The sight of a human being torn apart by dogs was a spectacle designed to remind the masses of the absolute power the rulers held over their lives. The screams of the condemned mixed with the sounds of tearing flesh, creating a grotesque performance that played out in front of a captivated crowd. As the victim's body was slowly consumed, the onlookers, mesmerized, would stand there, often silent, watching the terror unfold. For the crowds, this wasn't just about death. It was about seeing someone pay the ultimate price, a visual lesson in the consequences of defying the law. Over time, witnessing such gruesome executions became a normalized part of society. The shock that might have initially accompanied the sight of such violence eventually wore off, and what was once horrifying became simply part of the public landscape. The brutality of the punishment wasn't seen as out of place. It became expected, an everyday part of the system of justice. As these executions continued, the numbing effect on the public grew. What had once been shocking and appalling slowly became an entertainment, with people not just witnessing the punishment but looking forward to it. They would gather in crowds, eager to see the suffering unfold, and walk away after, unaffected, as if they had just witnessed a sporting event. This desensitization to human suffering was not accidental. It was a tool used by rulers to reinforce their authority. The public display of violence was as much about entertainment as it was about instilling a sense of fear and control in the population. The psychological impact on the witnesses was profound. Children, in particular, were exposed to this violence from a young age, their minds shaped by the brutal spectacle. Watching someone be torn apart by animals could desensitize a child to violence, altering their perceptions of life and death. The fear these executions instilled in society was meant to remind everyone of the consequences of disobedience. It wasn't just about the terror of the condemned. It was about using the fear of the crowd to reinforce the total control the rulers had over their subjects. Children grew up with the idea that this violence was a natural part of life, and society's acceptance of such brutality contributed to the cycle of fear and submission to authority. As these spectacles continued, society became increasingly numb to the horrors that unfolded in front of them. The impact on the human psyche was irreversible, as the line between justice and entertainment blurred, and the concept of violence as punishment was ingrained in the social fabric. The spectacle of executions by dogs not only demonstrated the power of rulers, but also shaped the worldview of the people, leaving them with the idea that cruelty was an acceptable tool for maintaining control. It was not just the victim's life that was destroyed. It was the society's humanity, hollowed out by repeated exposure to such unspeakable violence. As the 19th century progressed, the world began to undergo significant shifts in its understanding of cruelty and punishment. The changing views on human rights, driven by the rise of humanitarian laws and moral reforms, saw the gradual phase out of animal-based executions, including the horrific practice of being eaten alive by dogs. Reformers, driven by a growing sense of compassion and a desire for more humane treatment, began to challenge the brutality of such punishments. Public opinion began to turn against the public spectacles of violence, with more and more people questioning the moral foundation of using animals to execute humans. These shifts in thinking were sparked by a number of influences, including the rise of the Enlightenment, which brought with it an emphasis on individual rights, the value of human life, and rational justice. As the world became more aware of the impact that such brutal executions had on both the victims and society as a whole, the idea that dogs should be used to devour criminals began to be seen as not just barbaric, but as morally unacceptable. Reformers, social thinkers, and lawmakers began to fight against the legacy of such horrific practices, pushing for a more evolved and humane system of justice. The movement toward modernization and a new moral framework in criminal justice also played a significant role in ending such executions. As legal systems evolved, the methods of punishment began to focus less on public humiliation and violence and more on rehabilitation and reformation. Societies began to reject the idea that the public spectacle of suffering was a necessary part of maintaining order and enforcing justice. Public executions slowly became rarer, and new forms of punishment, such as imprisonment and capital punishment, by hanging or guillotine, replaced the brutal practices of earlier times. Yet, despite these advancements, the practice of dog-eaten executions remains a stark reminder of how deeply embedded violence once was in the fabric of justice systems. For centuries, the idea of executing criminals through savage methods was not questioned. It was the norm. But as the world progressed, people began to see the flaws in a system that relied on such inhuman cruelty. Today, we no longer witness such executions, but the history of violence, no matter how barbaric, still echoes through the corridors of time, leaving us to reflect on the dark and humbling origins of our justice systems. The decline of these methods serves as a reminder that even the most barbaric and demonizing practices can be reformed. But it also shows us how easily societies can normalize cruelty when there is no check on their power. While we may not see executions by dogs today, the legacy of such brutality still shapes our world, urging us to remember and reflect on the horrors of the past, so we never repeat them. The execution method of being eaten alive by dogs is a haunting reminder of the terrifying extremes societies have gone to in order to maintain control and instill fear. It shows us that power, when unchecked, can be used to justify unspeakable cruelty, turning violent death into a public spectacle. For those who witnessed these executions, it wasn't just a punishment. It was a performance, a grotesque display meant to demonstrate the ruler's power over life and death. As we look back at these forgotten executions, we must remember that cruelty has always been a tool used by those in power to maintain order through fear and humiliation. These methods, though buried by time, reveal an unsettling truth about our collective capacity for cruelty. History's darkest practices, though no longer in use, continue to haunt us, reminding us of the human cost of absolute power and the dangers of ignoring the value of human life. We must remember these brutal chapters of history not as distant tales of the past, but as warnings that, in the right conditions, the darkness of humanity can emerge again. History is dark, and we must remember it.